All right, we got one more coming in. It's about 4 minutes after the top of the hour, so we're getting started. This is the Protocol.Love Facilitators Guild Introductory Conversation, Part 2. And this is definitely more of kind of an open flow. Ask your questions, get your questions answered. Let's talk about what we're doing here. We don't have any presentation planned or anything like that. Hopefully everybody here had a chance to review the first session, the first part of this introductory conversation, where we did do more of a presentation style thing and explained really what we're up to here, what the possibilities are, what the proposal on the table is. Do we form a facilitators guild group that would actually work on a collective foundational document? That's definitely one fairly clear proposal, way to proceed, but really it's whatever emerges is great. And so this conversation and the other two that we'll have tomorrow, this last one will be about, well, exactly 36 hours from now. So we'll hopefully have some clarity at that time that we can announce and move forward with. So with that, yeah, questions, comments, concerns. Did everybody watch? Anybody not see the first session? Okay, awesome. There, Hattie, now I see your silhouette. That's great.
Good. Well, I could start by saying that I did see the videos and I did read I read the article, and I also read what's on the website. So very happy to read every detail in there. So for what I saw, not much comments. I do have a comment about what you just said right now, is that about forming the first group of people. I would call it a network. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Since it will be, I mean, I'm speaking from myself. I'm joining in, and I'm somehow already my own organization doing something similar.
Yeah.
So it's a group of people and organizations and friends, and that's why I felt maybe network could be.
All right. So like instead of Facilitators Guild, you mean Facilitators Network?
I mean, no, guild works well, actually.
Okay.
Guild is nice, because guild is people with different functions coming in, so that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea is to come and steward some standards, ways of approaching people who could use help with Protocol.Love implementation, just so we have a standard way of approaching that. Would you like help with the collective foundational document or some other kind of consultation? Reach out to the guild. The guild has a standard process for handling your request and getting with you and assigning some facilitators or whatever. Like, I'm just making stuff up right now, but that's kind of the rough idea of what we're proposing might be a great way to proceed.
It seems to me that because the process of making or creating the foundational documents is likely to evolve quite quickly, having a focus point of a facilitators guild will make sure that everyone who's facilitating that guild is in touch with the latest version of the protocol.
That's right.
So it feels to me like, just from my perspective, I would like to help facilitate lots of these foundational documents for specifically areas of the project that I'm working on to weave together a distributed seed library. It would be really useful to have sort of like a mother tree to go to like check in, this is the latest version of way we've learned to automate the foundational document process, and just having a foundational document as sort of like I think Hedy used a word there about at the start, the formation of this first team, like
guild network.
Guild, yeah, I think guild is the right word, but the fact that this would be like the first one, so
Yeah.
you'd know, well, it's not necessarily other people couldn't do it different ways, but it would be nice to, if anyone could sort of like poke their head into the guild and see, oh, that's what the guild is, that's the direction they're going at the moment.
Right.
An unofficial compass of some sorts.
That's right.
Yeah, so that feels like really good to me, and I would love to be part of that just from a learning perspective.
Right. The approach here is definitely just proposing standards and having some means of agreeing on those standards, just like kind of the RFC process, a request for comment. So here's this idea. We get a Facilitators Guild. Here's the Protocol.Love specification. What do you guys think? How do we make sure we've covered all the bases, that this is that these standards that we would propose, if agreed upon, would last for some time without too much modification. And it may take us a couple of internal evolutions to reach that standard, which is great. And so, yeah, I think that's what this guild would try to be doing. And there's several standards organizations we've identified that we want to be reaching out to with this stuff, that to say, if you want to operate with vulnerable transparency, this is the global standard agreed upon by these standards organizations, including Protocol.Love Facilitators Guild. These are the standard ways you can go about operating real time with full vulnerable transparency, using Protocol.Love. And so
I feel like one of the good focus points would be of that Facilitators Guild would be to start with the CoGov ontology and almost review that and expand it. What language is being used by the Facilitators Guild?
Yeah.
And a lot of that, I feel, would just feed directly off the CoGov ontology, but the process of reviewing that would probably evolve it in itself and probably deepen it.
Yeah, that's certainly the idea. And the idea is that none of the proposed ontology obviously needs to stick either. But it is definitely critical to be using the same language here when we talk about these things. So currencies, the 4 types that have been identified and proposed thus far over the years, basically mostly by me, in collaboration with others for sure. Some initial feedbacks, but yeah, 4 categories of currency: of fiat, influence, equity, and impact currencies is really important to agree on and understand.
And relating to other projects that might be using the language in a different form. So what other projects are using impact currencies, even though they maybe haven't called them impact currencies, because that sort of highlights where we've got a potential to harmonize our language and basically use the Protocol.Love framework. I feel a lot of organizations are close to doing parts of this. So by analyzing what they're calling those parts they're doing, it sort of begins that process of, okay, yeah, you're already using impact currency. We've just used different language for it. And we've also got broken it down to equity currency, fiat currency, and various decision-making.
Yeah, influence is the other one. But so and that's definitely okay. Like the usage, like it's kind of the same concept as, how we consider legalese, right? Versus regular English or regular, when you can call it whatever you want, like in a public facing sense or a simple, easy to understand sense that flows with conversation. I hope the terms we're coming up with, the language and the ontology that we're proposing, does allow for a lot of that to just flow naturally, but there's nothing that says anybody, must use these terms in their public facing stuff or whatever. But when you get in the conversations behind the scenes about what we're doing with Facilitators Guild, and when you're getting in touch with the greater network, hopefully we have shared language there, right? So we can call it something up front for the public, but we know internally, when we're looking at like certain interfaces in certain windows into the ledgers, we'll have a different language we use. These are the accountants and the attorneys, more that can really be familiarized with this language and be more of sticklers to the clarity. Is that what you mean? Do you mean an influence currency right here, an impact currency here? And
so I would feel into it as like, if I wanted to be part of a facilitators guild for Protocol.Love, there are 3 things that I'd really feel valuable to draw on. And one of those would be sort of my peers validating the ontology. So we're all in agreement that these are what the different things mean. Secondly, would then probably be examples of foundational documents that have been formed of those who want to share them. And then thirdly would probably be a directory of other facilitators. And those are the 3 things that immediately kind of jumped out at me as like, that would be great, because then I can kind of connect with colleagues if I've got any queries with the directory, look at examples, and possibly evolve those examples into templates that would just feed into automating the process, so it's easier and easier for people to create these foundational documents.
Right. Directory of Facilitators, example, collective foundational documents. I mean, yeah, and the examples are, you know, they'll be the real ones, right? They'll be as real as they are examples. So we'll be starting, you know, we're doing this all kind of on paper, on digital paper, on Google Docs is the recommendation. You could do it any way you want, but that's been the easiest way we found. Nobody's come up with a better proposal on that yet. For now, we're gonna start doing this on the holochains soon. So Brian Takita is our lead developer on that. He's working on Protocol.Love as a holochain protocol. It's in the GitHub. You can see his work on that proceeding. And when that's done, you'll be able to take your collective foundational document and write it as an entry on a holochain somewhere. And once that's done, you'll have your hash that identifies your collective uniquely in the world of collectives. At that point, you could take that and register it with the directory for sure. So, and of course, it's important to understand that that is a totally optional step, right, to register it with a directory from a technical perspective. Holochain is the virtual ether. It is the virtual universe, right? Everything is possible there. We can have entire galaxies of tens of hundreds of thousands of collective foundational documents of organizations in a whole economy together that may not be in the directory because they just didn't do that. And that's okay. And they can exist totally kind of in this hidden part of the universe that nobody ever knows about. And then somebody may accidentally discover it someday. And and if and when that happens, we could, in theory, send a crawler in there that could crawl and start indexing all the collective foundational documents it finds and creating this the interface that would allow you to browse the universe of collectives. So those basic projects are all being modeled out from a technical perspective. That's kind of happening. But yeah, that's a cool thing about it all.
And it seems to me that the Facilitators Guild would probably be the optimum place to kind of stay on track with that. Obviously, at the moment, just doing a Google Doc is accessible to me, but maybe as, you know, things develop on Holochain, I'd like to like learn with that process. Like, okay, this is actually how we were doing the foundational documents before, but now, was it Ryan you just said who's working on it? Brian has developed these tools, so we can actually now use these. And there might be a little bit of an onboarding process each time within the Facilitators Guild, like, oh, we can do this now, or we can do that now, or we can do this. Oh, here's like a plugin that someone made to access and browse all these past foundational documents that people have built and input their feedback around.
Right. Yes. So directory of facilitators, example collective foundational documents, which is essentially a directory of collective foundational documents as well. Was there anything else? I think there might have been a third thing you mentioned worth noting.
Just yeah, the examples, the like the validation of the ontology, or like a space for people to add to that ontology.
Right.
Because I imagine as the process of facilitating the Protocol.Love foundational documents evolves, so will the ontology, and so will the facilitating it will evolve.
Yep.
it will all feed back into those other processes.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I can't wait to be to hear the feedback that says, maybe you should call this instead. Maybe influence currency should be called this, or whatever it is. That's really the stage we're at, is being able to tweak that stuff before we kind of lock it in as a standard.
And how it links to stuff that isn't necessarily in the defined ontology, but is in the collective field in the same sort of, those guys are working on something similar. They've called it something different, but maybe we can sort of, as a facilitators guild, reach out and say, we've been working on this. We've just called it X currency.
Right.
Are you interested in maybe harmonizing our protocols so we're actually using the same thing? Because we are using the same things in everything but the name.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'd be super curious about that. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't really found anybody proposing this level of standard for like just generic vulnerable transparency for anything and everything all the time. I haven't really seen that. That doesn't mean it isn't out there. So if it is, please, let's find that. Yes, let's be in collaboration. This is super critical at this time. But I did want to say that I think, this meeting so far is another example. One of the real goals of this project from a broad perspective is to empower the feminine, to allow just to create the sand in which just enough structure can be there, right? So that as the water flows, or as this emergence of activity in the ecosystem flows, the water is the feminine, and the masculine is there just to kind of track that and hold some structure around what organically flows. And to that extent, to the extent that when we see females, we generally tend to make an assumption that they tend to be more feminine embodied. We would love to see more females, more feminine embodied people, regardless of gender, taking leadership here. And, I can speak for myself that I definitely tend to be more masculine embodied. So I think this paradox we have, Jubilee, thank you for being here, is that I really want to see more feminine voices stepping up and to be part of these conversations. And then I and others that have gotten it this far can kind of just step back again and just look for that ability and the opportunities to say I think that's the thing we want to create structure around. That's something we can latch onto and create a standard around. These are things that should be definitely an emergent process that we want to create. So I know that I assumed this would be a smaller call because it's 6 a.m. It's early U.S. time. Probably a lot of activity on the West Coast. A lot of interest on the West Coast here with what we're doing of the U.S. And this is an opportunity for Europe. But yeah, I mean, really, the hope is, can we get some female embodied souls to step up into leadership, and then I can shut up more. That really is something I'm hoping for out of this.
I have something to say. I noticed that the document is more oriented towards people starting from scratch, but it doesn't necessarily. Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, I don't know if the plan is to develop that for the future, but so far I don't see the scalability up like today. I don't see how it would scale to when different teams start working together. You have multiple roles, multiple committees. There's multiple branches of the organization. Then is that on the to-do list, I guess?
Well, yeah, that's inherent. Anybody can start any committee, subcommittee, subgroup. There's nothing, we don't have any ability to say what you can and cannot create a collective foundational document and start operating with governance operations with, right?
So so you see this as a fractal document that could be adopted at different levels of the organization.
Absolutely. That's generally, the proposal in there that I've discovered is and from all the wisdom of many facilitators that I've been in contact with over the years, you don't want any one group of people to be too big, any one council, any one group of people where you're going to sit together, allow all voices to be heard, where people can dance well with the tension of not speaking until it's a really powerful moment to speak where that language needs to be offered into the space. Like that, finding that balance almost always gets unmanageable above like 12 people, above like 10 people, you know. So definitely keeping the actual councils where you want to have an in-depth relationship, definitely it seems to be the wisdom is to keep those small. So so lots of them is the critical piece. So in order to keep them small, if you need to cover a lot of ground and being very closely coordinated around a lot of different topics, definitely break them up into subcommittees and subgroups that can steward various sets of assets along the way. And then establish a very clear relationship between the groups is definitely the recommended way to go on that.
So then,
just real quick, a lot of this is also documented in the Digital Co-Governance Web, which is some of the original writings on all this from about 3 years ago. But you made one other important point in there about startups versus existing organizations. That is definitely a critical piece. It's really easy to do this. It's low overhead to do this process as a startup. If you are an organization that's been operating for 5 years, there's huge overhead with implementing Protocol.Love, because what we essentially have to do is go back and remap your entire transaction history, both in economics and governance and everything else, into Protocol.Love. So that's a big undertaking to do that.
That's what we've been doing, and I've actually found it once I got my head around that's what we were doing. We weren't starting it as a foundational document. It's become a lot easier, and I feel like that feeds into the scaling question or flag that you raised. Having a template or a library of templates rather than just one template. So, this is a template that might be useful if you're already 3 years into your business or something, and you're trying to, convert from this style of governance to a Protocol.Love vulnerable transparency style of governance, from all different types of industries and all different types of projects. It would make it a lot easier to then scale the protocol if there were various types of on-ramps.
Absolutely. I mean, hopefully the idea is that the proposal made as to what data you share at your startup phase is a pretty standard set of things, right? So no matter what you do or how you're operating, these are the standard questions you want to make sure you operate with and share with the world. And that's all documented on Protocol.Love, which is a URL. If you just go to that URL, it's there. Then then the specializations, the standardization of specialization is something we would certainly expect to see start happening. So in other words, if you're a manufacturing company that's selling retail products, so to speak, that's manufacturing something and moving it out to the market, and you're doing all that in-house, for instance, that's one template that of probably standard sets of currencies that have been identified, right? So Protocol.Love identifies the categories of currencies that exist, but the actual specific instance of currencies and what your organization is flowing with is something you determine at the time of the creation of your collective foundational document or later, right? That's fine, but those specific types of currencies are where we get into templates. So it says if you're going to be a manufacturing company and sell, for instance, online, you manufacture in-house, you have inventory in-house, you ship all the product in-house, you have a website that sells your products, for instance, that type of business could very clearly be a standard set of internal currencies that you would use to do all that. And so that would certainly, I would imagine, become a template, yes, that others could use. And of course, all of this being completely open source, on the holochains, just an instance of a collective foundational document you can just grab and modify. That's always going to be possible.
That was a good question, Hadi, and I want to just extend what Ray and Ed were talking about and making some of it relative to preparation. So, for example, this conversation popped up yesterday with Ed, because brilliant minds show up to these calls and want to move it into these really valuable directions, which as a as a small group of stewards, we can't do. That's where the guild really comes into play, where guild members, facilitators, are those who work in the startup industry, who invest in startups, who start companies for a living, who are starting a new eco village, who's going to have an ecosystem. And in that ecosystem are going to be several different businesses, maybe a manufacturing business for hemp production. You know, there's 37 acres growing hemp, and half of it's medicinal. The other half is going for building products. Two different businesses, same supply chain. And some of these different collectives, like the Seeds Collective that Ed was talking about, that he's working with, that is developing their own collective, their own technology, and going in and mapping out certain metrics that have to do with supply chain and understanding the supply chain of, let's say, a hemp seed to a hemp plant, to the farm that it's growing on, to the eco village that owns the land, to the collective foundational document that's organized or in that particular business that has particular metrics in it, because it's a manufacturing company. And then there's also a distribution company, which is the farm. Behind it, which is the source, behind it, which are the people. And so in scaling this particular idea now, when you look at the trend is independence, the trend is freedom, the trend is sovereignty, the trend is, I don't want to work for you anymore. Plain and simple. Yeah. I love what you guys are doing. You have a great asset. Your website is amazing. I can log in and do all the coolest things ever. However, it's not actually transparent. I don't actually have a vote in it. I actually wouldn't do everything the way you're doing it. That is the point that we're really stuck at and we want to stay at right now, which is in the ground, there's a post, a sign, everybody's a pilgrim. They show up to the post and they can either go to game A, where they just left, kind of go back and say, okay, I'm gonna go try to go to this big company and convert them to operate with vulnerable transparency. We can get all those transactions on the blockchain because then we're going to be amazing because we'll have all that stuff. All those transactions valuable right now. Do they provide value to the overall ecosystems that are already operating in vulnerable transparency right now? Do some of these historical patriarchal patterns that are built into these companies, are they able to become fluid like that water, like that sand in a river, and take up their places in a new dynamic? Probably not right away. Like Hadi, you're kind of easing into, is that for an existing organization that is operating in game A, a centralized way of doing things, from fundraising to investment to partnership deals to corporation forming, all of these structures are agreements and contracts that those groups of people are entering into that are now bound to until something changes. With vulnerable transparency, that all gets reset. And I see Aaron Morgan's on the phone here, and I invited Aaron because, well, first of all, Aaron's an entrepreneur, and he's been starting businesses for probably his whole life. He's a tattoo artist and entertainer, and super awesome designer, and he gets the universe, and then he compacts it into a small idea and says, all right, let's do this thing right here. And then these group of people come together and like, yeah, let's do this thing right here. And then the questions start popping up around metrics, around transparency, around how we're going to operate, who we're going to do business with, where are we going to get our funds with. In this state of vulnerability, we're already there. It's easy for us to grab a digital template like a foundational document and say, look, everybody, let's define these things. And then everybody can define them. And then the flow begins, the flow patterns are set from the beginning. That's much easier to work with, obviously, because we're dealing with that creative energy. And I believe, at least from where I'm coming from, I see that's the greatest potential for scalability here. First off, Ray and I have, and Ed, all of these people on this call and involved so far have a lot of startup experience, have a lot of experience in the business world with new company formations, new organizations, and also know how to capture people. They're like, I have an idea, and are coming out of game A and want to arrive into a trajectory somewhere. And that is vulnerable transparency. That is Protocol.Love. That is a new formation of a collective that come build an ecosystem. Instead of coming and build a website and an idea and maybe a small little thing, it can still be that, but now do it with everyone else. Open it up in such a way that the participatory nature of the universe and everybody involved can now move their energy into your new project. That's hard to do in an existing infrastructure because those power dynamics and those structures are in place as soon as the first funds are released, as soon as the first piece of paper is signed with the legal authority. As soon as those things are done, the agreements are game A, which means it's a game A organization. If the transparency model in Protocol.Love comes first, it's a lot easier to then go create an LLC, a B corporation, a C corp even, although tax-wise that probably would not align unless you're going to be a bigger business. Now those agreements and contracts are made from a different source. They're made from a much more vulnerable, much more transparent, much more council-defined set of operational structures. Right. So now it's easy to take those instruments, those game A instruments, and use them differently versus being used by them from the very beginning, where now I owe taxes to everything I may or may not make, depending on how my accounting goes. But knowing how to enter into those things from the beginning is just much easier, and then scale from there. So bring game A energy, bring game A people and resources into these new eco-village projects, into these new community projects that have the opportunity to find, let's say, a distribution channel immediately. And so now what was a game A company can say, oh, well, I actually really was going to get into that. We have a small team of people that's been looking into it. Why don't we just break them off, create a foundational document, start this new thing, and then see how that plugs into the whole later on, because they're still operating assets. They're still operating a digital currency now. And so kind of looking at that investment model and spreading it out so that now game A can get their smaller projects like ingrained, and then start to see it kind of permeate through that larger kind of subset of control structures.
So then scalability of an organization would mean the addition of other organizations, which are the more focused groups. Is that a good
yeah,
summary?
like in a let's say a large organization grows to a certain size. In that original council of maybe 8 or 10 people that created that, or the board or founders created that, and it gets so big, and now they have these other things they want to do. Yes, new foundational document, because it's a new group of people in the ecosystem. You still have a master foundational document for all of the stuff, but now within that, you've got other little venture funds set up or other little circles set up that are all working on their specific pieces that go towards that ecosystem. And that allows a much more autonomy in a larger organization to be specific and transparent.
Definitely, 100% agree. And then how do people communicate along that fractal? Because I see it like you just zoom in and you're in the same, you see the same kind of document, same kind of organization. But then how does information flow from the top to the bottom?
So the way that I almost feel it's not a top to the bottom thing, it's more of a circular or a spiral organization model. So to go back to the hemp example, you could have a hemp farm, a little community that grows hemp. They form their foundational document as a community, and they're like, okay, actually, we don't want to process this all ourselves. But there's another community down the road that has already started processing hemp. They've also formed a Protocol.Love foundational document. So that then creates like a great two really good bases to build a bridge between those two organizations or communities. And from that point, I almost see it as they almost breed together and produce another foundational document that may indeed cite both versions of their previous foundational documents, but still have its own sovereignty of like, this is what we're doing. We're just doing it with these two parties that came together also using this same framework for creating documents. And then they might have a different outline of what their mission is and what their intentions, and their mission might be to, okay, we're going to produce 1,000 t-shirts from this harvest. One party is bringing the production facilities and that expertise, and the other party is bringing the raw material. And they've then shown from the ground up that those t-shirts were produced completely vulnerably transparent, even though they came from different, or came as part of two organizations, the final product. And that's just a little example of t-shirts, but it could be much more complex, like building, you know, some really complicated software packages for these different communities to use, and they might involve having a lot of different parts of software, and the same process could be employed as creating that t-shirt to basically get each group to do its foundational document, and then get those foundational documents to sort of I think breed is the word that keeps them coming through, but breed with each other.
Well, one way collective foundational documents in different organizations identify each other as somebody they should be doing business with, or ought to be doing business with, or would consider doing business with, is when you identify that you've recognized similar currency flows within your organization. Wait a minute, so the currency you created is basically the same as the currency we've created. Now we get to merge currencies, right? Which is actually a fairly simple process from a technical standpoint. And we've enhanced the flow. We've taken two creeks and made a bigger river within the economy, right? And we can continue to see that happening on hopefully we'll see that continue to scale up to where when we look at things that are like on the commodities exchanges now, like these are things that are so globally recognized as important aspects of products and services that exist in our economy, that they've created futures markets on public exchanges, right? Like those kind of things ought to form into similar entities here someday, some way. But it doesn't look like a centrally managed and controlled exchange, right? It is a open source, co-governed exchange marketplace where valuable commodity currency flows can be identified and listed. So that's another answer to the question, I think, as to how we see this network start to come together.
Yeah, definitely that answers.
I'll add, Hadi, just before you go, how do you find them? Go to Protocol.Love and log in and find it, kind of thing. Like, as we're building the technology and the interfaces start coming together because the collectives are growing and the currencies and the metrics are flowing, when you log into the website, that's where you'll see kind of the ecosystem view of who's currently operating, what currencies do they have, who are they connected to, what work are they doing. Just simply logging into that website, at some point, you'll be able to immediately see the value as your self-organization, let alone if you're a facilitator going through a process with a new collective, you'll have the breadth to say, oh, wow, this is so similar. Why don't you guys talk about this? And all of a sudden there's a new group forming that didn't intend to in the beginning, and now it's growing as an ecosystem.
Yeah, I definitely see a lot of value in that, for sure. That definitely answers a big part of the question. And I'm very curious to see those specialized templates. I think that would be very impactful to scale the solution, because I am a believer that the solutions to the world's problems are embarrassingly simple. So to me, seeing those templates of, like, you know, hemp making, processing hemp, anyway, not to get into the details. An example I had in mind of where to explain my tension a bit more is when you have let's say, I don't know if I call it organization, but let's say organization for now, where you have the project management is like a group of people that are dealing with the people that are buying, logging orders, moving them to like whoever's doing the manufacturing component of things. And then there's the marketing component of things. So now that we're an example of an organization with three simple committees: project management, production, and marketing. So how would that play out? Would there be three different organizations? And then how do they transfer accountabilities out? That was more my question.
Right. That you get to decide. There's no predetermined way, right? So
who is you in that case? You being every person or every group?
You who are the stewards of the collectives that have been created. So primarily, you know, generally we're going to start somewhere with one collective, right? And so you formed that collective, you've got all your operating agreements within that collective, because that's part of the process of doing the collective foundational document. And so one of the decisions you can make in there is, hey, we should spin off the marketing team into its own collective, because there's no reason to be dealing with all the marketing issues in the primary core. It's taking up too much of our time. So at that point, you're going to make decisions as to what is the relationship between the primary council, which is a common ontology we use, and the marketing sub-council. Is it at the behest? Is it at the service of the primary council? I mean, in the standard, kind of game A corporate structure, that would always be the case. Of course, the marketing department is always at the service of the board of directors. But that's a decision you can actually talk about. And is it, or should this be an independent entity that kind of operates on its own and doesn't, and can serve the primary council, but doesn't exclusively have to serve the primary council, and actually have its own level of decision making? And then the arrangement between those two collectives, any obligations or expectations, all that is defined in a shared statement of intent kind of document, which we've also got some templates for floating around. So two collectives, the shared statement of intent says, here's how we are operating together, and we both agree on that, and here's why it's a win for this collective, and here's why it's a win for the other collective, and here's why it's a win for the world.
And so at any point they can decide that they can start as like a sub, I don't remember quite the term well, as a subgroup, and then sub-council, and then they could say, well, now we want to take marketing contracts with other organizations or foundations. So then they become independent and they go on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the way I see it, is it really empowers people to stay together because they always have this freedom or this sovereignty to split apart. There's this sort of irony in it that if you give people the freedom to part whenever they want, they're actually probably going to stay together and stay on the same path because they always have that breathing room they're never trapped in a corner. You've never trapped the team into a divot, like this is the rails that you're on, this is what you're doing. Actually, the innovation is free to go wherever it wants, like this sort of conversation is. And if you've brought a team together to do something with a foundational document and you sort of fulfill that goal, you might not necessarily want to dissolve the team. You might then just want to be like, oh, we've got a great flow now. Let's just amend our mission and go on to helping these people out or doing these projects, which to me feels really empowering and an efficient way of sort of progressing our the way we sort of spend our energy and our attention. There seems to be a lot of collapsing of working groups when they sort of fulfill what they've done, whereas actually that's the hard thing, is to get people together in a nice flow, and we want to build that rather than sort of stifle that once we've done the first thing that we wanted to do with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to hear all that. May I add one more question? Next one is about how open will these organization documents be for other people to jump into the group? Because maybe many people will want to do the same thing.
That's a great question.
Ray? Do you want to try asking it again, Joel? I'm not sure I got the question.
Yeah.
So
I apologize for my language.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, what I heard is, so you have a document. How open is it for someone to see what you're doing and participate in the process?
Yeah.
Or alternatively, it's so open, how do you invite people? Like, how does that mechanism work? How is it open?
Like, especially in context with what you said about only 12 people being sort of the maximum number, maybe answer it with respect to the guild, the foundational guild document.
Right. Well, none of these are imposed limits, of course. If you want to have a council of 642 people, well, by all means have a council. Like, none of these are imposed limits. Like any kind of concept of imposed limits, you can just pretty much assume has nothing to do with what we're proposing here, because it's an open environment only to record what you're doing. And so whatever you do is what you do. The idea is never to tell you how to do things, other than we recommend vulnerable transparency if you want to really be serious about transforming the world. And that's probably why you're here looking at Protocol.Love, is because you believe in that. But one of the very key things it says right on the Protocol.Love URL, if you go there, is the reality of transparency. The reality of transparency is that it's always a choice. Transparency is always a choice, and it always takes extra effort. to be transparent, right? Like Joel and I can just have a conversation anytime we want. That's easy. But if there's some nuggets in there about that really related to a decision making around a collective, we ought to like make sure we document that and share it in some kind of ledger so that it can be seen in a vulnerable, transparent flow of information. That always takes extra work, and it's always it's really a commitment to vulnerable transparency that really is going to drive this. It's really a fundamental shift in the way we operate as humans, both on our interpersonal level and then as well as when we scale up interpersonal relationships. That's socioeconomics, really. So we're transforming socioeconomics by transforming the way we do interpersonal relationships. And of course, you can really look at it as your own, relationship with yourself. Your own internal mental processes can also start to embrace vulnerable transparency. And these are all things that seem to be part of the path. And so
it's all very organic. Some collectives choose a greater distinction of transparency in what they're providing and how. And others kind of have their own vision and they're stewarding it. And they know exactly where they're going. And this is a utility to be open more to the outside world, so to say, but not so much as to bring a new central council together. And I've also just even recently seen small groups grow and expand because of that openness, because of the transparency and the choice to be vulnerable. They say outside on a call, like this, oh man, wouldn't it be nice if we just had these things? Because like we're really on our purpose, except for when we get to this part and then we really challenge and we're really struggling. And then the next call, they just make a choice. So let's open up the calls, and the next call, somebody shows up and has that skill, has that passion, has that purpose, and says, hey, I heard about you guys, and yeah, I'm just looking for someone to plug in and start giving. And the group's like, oh my gosh, wow, yes, you have to be a part of this because you definitely represent the thing we were just talking about the other day. And it's like when you call your mom, like when you think about it, and she's like, oh, I was thinking about calling you today. It's already been set up, right? This is just a way to break down any barriers. It's a way to make sure the phone is connected. It's to make sure that the infrastructure is there for that organic, natural process to just continue to occur, which is a lot easier to do, especially when we're building new things. We're building a new eco-village, a new political party, a new huge organization that's going to have a lot of moving parts to do a lot of really complex things. Without transparency, we're not really enabling all of the different moving parts to be well, off the first day of the job, because otherwise they're going to be asking a ton of questions, and I have a lot of construct or context because the transparency has been funneled. Now it's got to go through the stream, and maybe someone wasn't available or didn't want to share anything, and so I'll just end it on that, and also kind of I'm looking at Michael's questions, which are really good questions as well, which are very relatable to this. Like, what does transparency and intellectual property have to do together? And that's a greater conversation we can get into next. But using the farm example, using the hemp example, using the multiple businesses and an ecosystem example, the transparency aspect of all that information and who's doing what, that being available alone is the momentum. That is the ability to kind of see where the flow is and let go or control. Let go, it just flows. Put your hands around it, and that's where the questions about what are you doing, why are you doing it this way, those start to come up, and there's no one to ask that except for the board of directors, and they don't want to answer anybody. So this just opens up that process in kind of a bi-directional way, and it's up to you.
Yeah, and just one final point to make on that, which kind of leads into the monopoly question that Michael asked, is the idea that we would ever like judge or enforce vulnerable transparency is the opposite of anything that would work, right? Because if we are, that is itself rivalrous behavior, I guess is the point, right? If oh, hey, I'm right, Tomo. Hey, Tomo. Michael is Tomo. Good, glad you're here. The idea that we would ever judge or say that an organization is less good in the world because they're operating with less transparency is the opposite of what we ever want to do here. We just simply want to encourage transparency and ultimately test the hypothesis, which is, frankly, this. is it inherently rivalrous behavior, or as a hypothesis, as a statement, it is inherently rivalrous behavior to avoid vulnerable transparency, right? That's the hypothesis that we get to test with all this. And we test it because we say, if we have a whole ecosystem of a whole economy forming where that's scaled up ultimately someday to where we have access to all kinds of assets and resources and goods and services, just like we have in game A. In game B, would that function much better because of vulnerable transparency? And my hypothesis is absolutely yes, it will. It will function as a much healthier organism that meets the needs of the life within the organism, the manufactured kind of organism. Yeah. So that's the hypothesis we get to test here, and it's always a test. We never act like we have the answer or we're failing, right? So yeah, monopolies, I think, in this environment are mostly impossible to have happen. You can't, if you're operating with vulnerable transparency, you really, and anybody feels in any way like you're getting too big or too powerful, they easily have a way to thwart that. And your openness as a vulnerably transparent operation ought to allow that energy to come in a positive way into your organization in a cooperative way, rather than in game A, when you feel like somebody's getting too big, you want to create a competitive venture, which in so many instances wastes a lot of energy. A lot, like people, for instance, collaboration tools online collaboration, group collaboration tools. Oh my God, there's like 100 of them that are awesome right now. They must have written with the same code 100 times. And, last I checked, software developers aren't, that's not cheap labor. Like, that's really talented schooling and engineering and talented people that are in high demand. So there is so much wasted energy in writing that same code over and over and over and over again. And that's not
in a monopoly environment.
Well, yeah, in a game A environment where you're in a competitive landscape and you're writing the same code, you're writing essentially the same code. Of course, it's not the exact same code. Because there's nothing wrong with competition in the sense that let's create the best solutions for the world. Like if we're going to compete
on that, I have a kind of a question I was kind of waiting to ask, but since you got on that, I'm curious about. Okay, I know I've spoken with Joel a little bit about the idea that, say, different communities would have different sets of funds, possibly their own currency or whatever. That obviously, I don't know a lot about the digital currency. Joel's new to teaching me about it, so I'm still a little bit new with all this. But what I'm curious about is when you talk about, grade A business and maybe even more so like incentive for other communities to be solely or more driven to work with other communities rather than like in a capitalist society going for the highest bidder, which would mean, if you're like, take the hemp, for example, again, you're now producing hemp, you have your cash crop. It may be more financially lucrative for your community to sell outside of the community. So what I'm kind of trying to figure out though, is there like an idea that eventually there might be like one currency, say, that governs the hierarchy of the whole system, i.e. like, okay, you have your community has its monetary system, but that monetary system then, say, when you're working in trade, is there any consideration for that when you're trading in this one particular monetary system, so that, for example, if that monetary system builds, it's more incentive for the communities to work inside of other communities. You may be taking less money in, say, some other form of currency, but in the hierarchy of the currency, you would be actually maybe gaining momentum with that one particular currency, so that that's sort of shared in a trade system, rather than like on a community to community and having to figure out how those currencies would trade between each other. So I don't know. That would be pretty much my question.
Yeah. Well, so I think you're talking about the tension between top down and bottom up, like standards, essentially, right? And and
incentive, because again, if I'm located in America and I can get top US dollar for the same product, what would be my incentive besides just being good humans, which is obviously the inherent point of this whole thing. But what would be the reason, say, I would pick another community, that maybe they only have money for you. They don't have, say, an equal trade or something that you need of their services, but you want to stay in the network. Is there some way that, say, the money that you grow in this digital currency, that's, say, the hierarchy, is there, like, I understand that Bitcoin, from what I know little about, but it has grown tremendously throughout the course of its life, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is, if these communities traded on one monetary system, wouldn't that, for my lack of better knowledge, wouldn't that like raise the value of that currency to where it, because it could translate into more American dollars traded in, wouldn't that give communities incentive to want to stay inside of the community, even though they could technically, maybe if the Bitcoin, let's say, wasn't as valuable as it was, they wouldn't be getting as many US dollars in return, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, any relationship to Bitcoin, to anything we're talking about with currency, just delete that, because we have no relationship whatsoever to blockchain or Bitcoin or any of that.
No, I know that. That was just my example of thinking of the most successful currency.
Great. So we would want to see the success of a currency within an ecosystem happen, because lots of people already identified that they're involved in the same kind of energetic flow, right? And we would want to see standards just kind of emerge. And so, yes, there's advantages to standard sets of currencies, no question. But the question is, do we try to go from a top-down perspective, say, here, we should have a standard around this one, or do we, right, the right time to propose the standard, to build coherence around the standard is the question, I think, right? It's not.
Yeah. Or just, if that is like something that's, been, thought about long-term, like, I guess I'm reaching a little further into the future, but trying to understand how the system would stay together in the long run. You know what I mean?
It's been thought about in that sense that yes, where we recognize we're working in the same kind of energetic flow of exchange, let's merge. Let's look for, because it's going to be inherently more efficient. That's what you're pointing out, I think.
Yeah.
And
well, that and like I said, it could be more. It could give people more incentive to only work with other communities that are, like, to pick them first. You know what I mean? So, like, not just because you want to and because you're involved in that organization, but because you can see the value building in the monetary system that you've created between each other. If you know what I'm saying.
Aaron, if I might jump in on what you're saying, because I think I understand a tension point that you're trying to articulate, and I think I can.
Please, by all means, thank you.
Frame it So what about, for example, I think what he's diving into is, say, monopolies derived out of super efficiency. So say, for example, a super currency has a more outsized influence because of the particular role that an organization plays within a specific, say, vertical industry. So like the first thing that came to my mind is say a marketing company, right? Or a marketing collective in this sense. So a marketing collective, they get really efficient at collecting and aggregating leads into a community that are the best buyers. They just happen to have the most access to the most varied resources, and they spend the most money. And that is what this marketing company or collective has transparently done, is they say, we are going to find the very best buyers who have the most amount of money, and we're going to be putting them in front of the best products and the best services. And we're going to be doing that so that we can make the most amount of money, collect the most amount of varied currencies for the least amount of effort. And they do that. They accomplish that. They're so good at doing that the currency that's specifically focused for marketing collectives, they end up basically having an outsized control of that. And then because by virtue of having more leads than anybody else within that collective, right? So having access to more responsive communities that are more desirable to more varied verticals, because that's all they do. They just collect people and they sort them into buying groups based off of like their income and all that. So they're just extremely good at that. That means that the marketing currency would therefore also have an outside influence over every other industry that needs leads, and that would be outsourcing those leads. So the only way to possibly be able to compete with them at that point would be to formulate your own internal marketing collective that does what they do better, with fewer access to those resources and fewer access to the momentum derived out of building those varied communities and positioning themselves within the ecosystem itself. So it's without having to violate any of the transparency rules, and without having to do anything which would basically just being super efficient at what they're doing. And by being incredibly efficient, they're also incredibly profitable, and they have an unusual and unexpected influence over other collectives, because their particular collective happens to be a hub and a foundation for what basically every other collective would have to operate through or compete with.
Like good business.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Right. Yeah.
It
So
does.
they essentially,
if you're vulnerable and you're transparent, you're clearly, it's let's say a community I'm involved in, it would be, our choice to look at their community for what it is, and be like, hey, you're vulnerably transparent. We can see what you're doing. We know what you have and what we need. Yeah, I mean, I can see where you'd automatically be more inclined to go with them because you know what they're up to. Right?
Yeah, and not only that, Aaron, but if you did have, Tomo, you were using an example, if somebody saw an efficiency that they're missing, like in game A, the idea would be, oh, let's start a competitive venture, let's get lots of capital, and then we'll outcompete them and shut them down. In a vulnerably transparent world, you have your way to say, hey guys, I see a way to make the system more efficient, and you can find a way to have your voice.
And they could just as easily, look at your formula and be like, wow, if we implemented these few changes, we would be at the same level or whatever.
But there's a certain, but what I'm saying is there's a certain point where where simply having a saturation. So for example, if what their system is that they've gotten to be the best, they've perfected and refined the ability to create communities, okay, and collectives of special interest, that is so that basically, to optimize it beyond what they've done, you're going to get very many diminishing returns, right? And they've already built these large outsized communities, so these communities have more members. Having more members is the resource that you need to make a community more appealing. Sure. So there is no way to essentially compete with a larger community, because that is the value intrinsic in communities, and that is the resource that is being traded with it by marketers for putting them in touch with products. So if those communities are formulated out of people being specifically interested and wanting access to the best quality products and things that are out there, what you have is you have a marketing company that has the largest single list, and the only other way to compete with them would be to build a community that is bigger than them, but they already have the biggest community.
Yeah.
So how do you build a bigger community when they have the most efficient system?
Yeah.
I would say that the best is not the same for everyone. So that's where the locale becomes quite interesting, because the best for you might be a product that's, feeding the farm next door to you, because you then know, your community has better security. The best for me might be buying the hemp that's nearer me. So I feel like it's the game A is like highly incentivized to like push everything towards competition, and like there is one thing that's best. But in reality, you're going to get like hundreds of mangoes around the world that are all claiming to be the best mangoes, and the guy who grows them is going to claim to be the best. Yeah, so I know what you're talking about in the terms of the data, like how you push the information flow. But if it was all vulnerably transparent, you wouldn't feed those systems, because it wouldn't be in your best interest if they were disempowering you. So actually, that's kind of what's happened in a lot of this crypto stuff, is people have seen that they're building and they're feeding with their attention some of these cryptocurrencies, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum, that are becoming too dominant, and they've just forked them and they've done other projects. That's why there are thousands and thousands of them. And that sort of gives you an indication of why that's not going to happen, because of this ability to fork it and to take.
So in other words, you're saying that the smaller competitors would necessarily be able to temporarily band together to provide a competitive advantage for those collectives over that to take market share.
Collaboration is their competitive advantage. That's
ultimately it is, right?
Yeah,
the openness of collaboration should always, lead to the greatest efficiencies of scale that's possible, in theory. And so that's what we get to find out. And so let's honor somebody, or Jubilee raised her hand, used a little raise.
Can I just add one point before we move topics?
Yeah, and I need to go here very soon, so we got to. Okay. I need to go, so you guys continue. But
yeah, I'll stay. If you could just add me as a co-host on the Zoom, that'd be great.
Cool.
Just for this group, especially in the interest of facilitating, we are facilitating the creation of currency. Digital currency is of course going to be where it's going to be held. And to Aaron's point and everyone else's around currency markets exchanges. Let's use a quick example. Aaron's community builds their own currency, and they have 4 different currencies, and they have their own metrics. Hadi builds their own currency at their collective. Ed at Seeds, their own currencies, the collective. All of them are built on the base currency called hollow fuel. Hollow fuel being an important catalyst to understanding the possibilities of growing exchange, growing different sorts of economies, and having non-rivalrous behavior within that economy. So that, to your point, Tomo, about a marketing organization or collective that's so efficient, they have such a big list, they're just so good at, Aaron just gives them a call and says, hey, this is what we need, and they're like, here you go. And now all of a sudden the value is just built into the collaboration. There's no really seeking or looking for it, because the incentive is the fact that it's so open to collaborate. All of those currencies are still fundamentally built on a foundational digital currency called hollow fuel. And hollow fuel is important to understand at some point for all of us, because the more people that are building these collectives, the more people that are building organizations that have applications that are running on the hollow chain, the more access to data that we have. And the more access to data that we have, the more transparency we have. And that in itself allows the system to become so smart by employing digital technology and AI and all of these things to affect any counterbalances in those different currencies as they're getting closer together. Like today with, with cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're locked into the way everything works. Bitcoin, there's only so many. Ethereum, there's a certain way to generate it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hollow fuel is generated by people using holochain networking, essentially. So the more computing power that we're all building communities, and then we pull an open source app from the repository, we look, now we have our own app that does governance and trading, and I can find collectives to do work with, and wow, all of a sudden that data is still built on hollow fuel, which is a digital currency. And so as hollow fuel grows in value, the base market coins or currencies like Aaron was talking about, each of our currencies, one of them might outperform some of the others. They're still in the same ecosystem, built on the same foundation. As long as we're all playing together, all of our currencies are growing. The way that we increase our value in relativity to another currency is in collaboration. Like the only way is to really collaborate with that transparency in place, because then maybe a new collective is formed, or a new venture fund is formed, which a slew of new projects are now getting off the ground because 2 communities got together, had a conversation, created a new foundational document based on this currency, created a new currency based on this currency. So this new flat currency that is nowhere, you're a startup, already has a value to anyone in this larger ecosystem. So you're starting out on the right foot with a value system to identify, and that's part of, I think, the facilitation process too, is all of us understanding the language, the currency, and the economics behind it, because the more organizations, the more data, the more transactions, the more communities running through these protocols on the holochain, all of our currencies are increasing when we're sleeping at night, because people are doing good things in the world. and Jubilee.
Now I don't even know what I'm going to say. There's so many things. I'm doing a solution raising in an hour and 45 minutes on marketing, because I don't think marketing is something that an individual business can fix on their own. I think it is something that's a bigger meta problem. The function of marketing is to get people to your business so that you can be profitable. If your purpose is purpose, if whatever you're in, right, to get more people to use hemp, to get more people to your community, then marketing is not really the thing. You want access to that list of people, and you want you want the story, the offer to go out to the most number of people so you can find yours. But if what you're in is to solve the problem for the individual, and your competition will do it better, then you want your competition to do it, right? If you're not in it for profit. And there's a common pool that solves of people and data that solve almost everything. Once, you know what I mean? Like every idea, if you have the common pool of people and data, I don't know if Holochain is doing that, because the idea that one marketing company has a list of people and that's their thing. Well, I'm on that list. It should be my thing, right? And I want to know which companies and products are going to have the most impact on my life, not which one they say is the best. And so I'm wondering, there wasn't even a question there, like how we focus on, for me, purpose over profit. And when you're focusing on purpose, I don't know, like the currency part kind of dies away, and you're focused on, like I said, there's a lot to talk about. Like I wonder how much of the currencies that are being created are being eaten up by the fact it's a lot of bureaucracy and accounting of currencies, versus solving what currencies solve, which is access to resources, and solving the trust interconnected problem that happens in contracts and creating teams together. But like, anyway, the currency part, I have to sit with and kind of understand better how they interconnect with each other. But one of the other questions I've had this whole time is, what exactly is the definition of a facilitator, as well as what is the skill and time commitment? Whether there's a common one, whether there's is this like accounting where now we're becoming accountants and there's like an overarching, you know what I'm saying? Like to be, I can't just say I'm an accountant. I have to go to school, get the degree, and then the accounting organization says whether I'm allowed to be one or not.
Very good question. And I'm going to start with a couple questions I heard you kind of describe in your processing around currencies, and then I'll get into time commitments and what is a facilitator, which is the whole purpose of this call. Number one, currencies, like the whole point of Protocol.Love, the whole point of embodying the new paradigm of currency, the flow of current, of energy. I'm going to use an example, actually, since Aaron's on the phone. Aaron and I were talking the other day. Aaron's starting a community, maybe more, maybe an ecosystem of communities, because Aaron has amazing ideas. They just flow right through, and they can easily be tangible in no time if the right people showed up at the right time. So thinking about that creative process, where typically the collective dream will come into one or a few people. If everybody's in alignment and listening, those people will actually find each other. They're like, oh, I have the same vision. Oh, wow, we should do that together. Then all of a sudden you're starting something new. And you start a community, and you realize that we have all this lumber to build all these houses, but we don't actually have the money to buy the equipment to actually turn that lumber, raw lumber, material essentially, into lumber to build these houses. But I was driving down the road the other day, and I saw this amazing little lumber yard, and went in there and talked to them, and they were really interested in bartering. And they said, we could do all this work for you if here's what our needs are. It was just a conversation. So Aaron leaves that, comes back to the community, and they have a circle and they talk about that. And everybody's really excited because everybody's like, oh, well, I had so-and-so over here could help do that. And then we could give them the thing that they really need, and that would really help them. Now all of a sudden the tides have changed. Like the group that needed something is now figuring out how to give something, right? The energy exchange, the contracts energetically have already been identified now. before anybody's written any paperwork, before any deals have been done, before people sit down at a table and do all of that stuff, you know, the semantics of what's already energetically been created. So now we have two groups seemingly disconnected, each have a service, a product, or a resource or a trade that's needed, essentially, to continue to operate. They found each other, agreed on a bartered exchange. That's going to go well for them, maybe for the next 6 months or 2 years. However, that business that does all of this work with wood has more needs because it's a business, right? Like this one community that has so many needs for 6 months to 2 years will eventually die off because they don't need to build houses anymore. Now they're just living in bliss, and now they're building water fountains out of all the springs. So now they need rock. So they're not really going and actively participating in that exchange that it was originally really needed. So where vulnerable transparency and this whole facilitation of this comes into play is if Aaron went to that very first conversation with one reason, just to connect, not to get something, not to find out if they could do the work that was needed, but to just connect and see if the energy is there and see if people drive, and then to create a relationship. If all of those things are done in a protocol, all those things become available in the holochain. And now this little entity that was over here, just out in the middle of nowhere, just doing what they've always done, taking in lumber and producing product, and hopefully someone is continuing to bring them business. What Aaron has done as a facilitator of just the flow, came in, identified the need like every other person before them has done, but then offered something in exchange, a different type of exchange. That exchange then went on the holochain. Now that organization is available for anybody to contact and see what they've done. Like, oh my gosh, I love what you guys have done there with Aaron's community down there in North Carolina. We have the same need. And we know that all of these communities, they're growing every day, every year. People are buying more land and figuring out how to build eco-villages and communities. So we know that type of work is not going to go away anytime soon. And we want to get more efficient. We want to get more sustainable and regenerative with how we're using these materials. So now we took an old lumber company with a bunch of old lumber people that have been doing things the same way for a long time, brought them into the 21st century, put them on the holochain, exposed who they are, what they did in a way that they were okay with, that they participated in. And now they have an abundance and a prosperity of opportunity because Aaron was able to just facilitate the opening of who it is that's doing what there. And all that really happened was the owner of the business that Aaron met when he walked in was super friendly, like he always is, and was ready to make a deal like he always is. But then he started talking to this guy, Aaron, who had all this energy and was talking about transparency and all these other communities, and he got all excited. So he was like, I'm going to do whatever that is because that sounds great. Now we're in the same network. Now we are fitting together because there is even a currency of exchange that's been identified in that particular bartered exchange that is now relative to many other points on the map that anyone, oh, I have that currency. I can identify with what Aaron is doing in this community. And yeah, I need that service. And they have the same metrics that I would be willing to participate in because I care about those metrics. You know, the way that the wood is being processed, what they're doing with any leftover materials, what they're doing in their community. All of a sudden that business is thriving. And Aaron got everything they needed and then some because they're continuing to network and communicate with people who are like, hey, Aaron, I heard you, I saw that you went and did this project and it was great. Could you tell me some more? Now, all of a sudden, so that creative process of individualization, so to say, of where a company or an organization says, I need this, we're going to get creative about it, we're going to go solve it in this way. Now that we can see how that's been done, this is an open source kind of culture way, we can see that, replicate that very easily. We can even make it automatic and autonomous because of the nature of holochain, because of the nature of these relationships and how this protocol works, which is super, super open. So that hopefully it answers a little bit about the currency here is, I think, a part of what we're all learning how to do is define our basic interactions in life as a currency. And that's why the word has been changed in its definition a little bit, as well as its spelling. Current. See the current of exchange, of flow, of creativity, which is different than a dollar for dollar value, because who knows how that dollar is created. I don't know. I don't really know if that's actually worth $1. So if I take that money, what else am I actually taking? As in an investment. Well, you're taking on a set of metrics. Aaron, if you can't do these things in a certain amount of time, your community won't have access to this capital any longer, which means you won't have access to the bartered exchange that you put into place, which means you won't get any more houses built if they stop, because the metrics that you aren't able to show up for, or things change. That's, you know, the rains came down and flooded everything, so you got to be put on hold. But somebody who gave you that $1 for an exchange to go down the process and go down to get the lumber worked on from the mill doesn't have the same value any longer. It's totally changed. It's actually reduced in value. Whereas if Aaron was fully empowered to walk in and say, listen, we can do everything that we say we can, and they actually do it, there's no need for an outside investment. So it's also another way of saying this is bartering. This is a form of how we take barter and exchange, equal exchange of gifting, put it on a ledger. That's really it. Once it's on a ledger, now Tomo can come along and be like, you know, I'm going to build the greatest marketing company in the world and the biggest list, and we're going to be the best at it. And I hope so, because we need that. What we don't need is Hadi to come along after Tomo is just rocking it and building communities and helping the ecosystems thrive. If Hadi comes along and says, oh, I can do that better than you or bigger than you, awesome. It's still not rivalrous. The important distinction is there's a mechanism for Hadi to go over to Tomo and say, you mind if I just import that list? Oh yeah, here, boop. Now Hadi's got the list, same list. There's no monopoly over the data any longer. And the data is open participatory, meaning everybody on that list has agreed to be on that list. Meaning they've agreed to be on Hadi's list, because Hadi has a relationship on a ledger and a protocol that's in relativity to Tomo, saying they have the same principles, very similar value system. And when they see currency and flow of energy, it's very similar. So when those rules match up in the ledgers and the systems, those currencies now essentially are the same, even though Hadi just started, hasn't done anything yet. And Tomo's been out there rocking it with a great team for 5 years. But they missed out on some specialties that Hadi's like just really focused in on. So now that this one process is gone, and that continues to grow and to harmonize larger communities, Hadi's coming with the same data, not being rivalrous, but being an extension, being an integration, being a facilitator of new possibility and new opportunity with the same information. And that's important. Is possibly the same code, possibly the same exact data from those same people and all the interactions and all the ledgers. Hadi has the same material to work with. So as those creative ideas come around that collective foundational document with what Hadi is specializing in, because he's agreed that I'm going to specialize in something because they are already doing that. Why would I want to do what Tomo does? Tomo does it really well, and everybody's getting service. And Tomo grows every time there's a need in the community. Tomo, that organization just grows autonomously, and it's beautiful, but they miss out on some of these specifics. And so that's where that data can be used without expecting a Tomo to do it. A Hadi can be like, oh, I'll do it. Can just show up, boop, click some buttons in a relationship, essentially, and start working with the same exact information, same exact code even, you know, copying and pasting code even, and websites, and spinning up a new website that has a totally different logo and look and feel. But wow, there's a lot of the same information there. It's just, it's formed differently to initiate a new process using the same information. So it's not rivalrous yet, right, in that sense. And how does that relate to becoming a facilitator? What are we here for? I believe everybody that is here is building something, and not only building something, but some things. Like there's a thing, and then there's a thing, and there's a thing, and there's a thing. And then we go back to like, oh, but I got to get the first thing done, because then these other things will connect to it. And as we start to move into this paradigm, feeling, shifting, thinking in a spiral or in a graph versus a table, we start to see that right now, if we knew how to tie in currencies, if we knew how to define metrics, if we knew a little bit about, accounting in this way, it's incredibly easy to make a transition to creating versus trying to harmonize something that's out of resonance, which is typically a game A organization a power dynamic structure where there might be a startup with an investor, with some partners, with some employees and some contractors, and all those agreements come together. And now we have to do these things this way, or else. The process of facilitating Protocol.Love is to see the difference in how we can operate and to facilitate groups going through that process of seeing for themselves and let it organically pop up, as well as being master creators or master builders, to be able to make all the connections to where if Aaron or you or Ed or by Hadi, thank you if you're leaving, or Hadi or Tomo.
It's actually Ed that's leaving. I still have one question.
Bye, Ed. As we create these collectives ourselves, we are facilitating the creation of new collectives, because we're essentially agreeing to become transparent, which means we're agreeing to be a template. Transparency is a template. And whether you're in informatics or data or communities or tattooing or marketing, once you have the template, you can kind of just copy and paste and then create from there. And it might be a totally new creation, but you started at a transparency where someone's like, here's these lines, here's the ink, why don't you color in the colors? And every collective will have different colors and slightly different lines. But if we all start from a common template, which is transparency, then we open source this culture a lot more from the very beginning, so that these relationships between communities, businesses, organizations, and governments are more transparent. And that's really all a facilitator does, is to look at the higher level meta of how these ideas and organizations come together, and to be the coming togetherness in facilitation so that they can come to fruition. And that's really all it is. And so the better that we are at that with our own projects, like if we are on 30 collectives as a facilitator, it's like being a philanthropist as a billionaire, essentially. You upped the game for ourselves to move into the process of philanthropy versus the process of creating silos. So now we're just giving, because we ourselves are part of these growing collectives, because we're facilitating and being a part of them, and we're seeing that that's how the ecosystem works, is we're all connected. And as that happens, we enable new facilitators. But back to the guild, is we are, that smaller group that is continuously talking about these things all the time. And the time commitments involved, it's up to you. Some of us are building, let's say, one community now, but likely we'll have 3 or 4 or multiple businesses and an ecosystem just from that one community, let alone what could come from that. And so the ability for us as a team to dedicate to how to bring these templates together, how to bring this information together, and how to facilitate these different types of groups is something that is not a job. It is a participatory action, of course, but it's something that when we decide to become a facilitator, most of us are already doing that, essentially. Like what we're doing in our life is already like facilitating groups in some way. Now what we're doing is plugging groups in a lot easier to a lot more resource. And we're reducing our time of talking to new groups or collectives and facilitating the little things that they get caught on by increasing the meta ability to see all of this stuff and say, let's start here. And then we can start to permeate down to the center, because we started with more common and open protocols in a process. So it's not an extra time commitment unless you become an active part of the guild in that sense. And that's what you want to do all day, is just help the guild members kind of really be armed for whatever resources might be necessary. But the most of it's just doing what we're doing already with a new toolbox.
Can I ask how reliant on Holochain is this work and this data and these people that are putting in their effort? If Holochain goes under, does everything go under? Because like there's already competition with Holochain. And if everything has to be anti-rivalrous, OmniWin with under that umbrella, but we're not dealing with wait, how do Holochain and DAO Stack work together? How fragile is it dependent on Holochain?
Excellent question. Well, with the absence of Ray being here, I'll answer it my own way. The future of humanity, technically speaking, depends on holochain. If humanity decides not to embrace biomimicry, not to embrace holochain, not to embrace these principles of metacurrency, then we are continuing to make the same choices we have. We're choosing federal systems based on centralization that are economic, that are social, that are socioeconomic, that are environmental. All of our policies are going to continue going the same way. If it's on a DAO, if it's on Stellar, if it's on blockchain, Ethereum, all of these are centralized ledgers. All of them require consensus within the centralized model that exists. Meaning, if you're playing a game, then you certainly can be distributed in making a decision. Holochain is much different. And one of the, I think, parts of the guild here is to really educate ourselves on how important this technology is. But not, some of us will be really connected to the technical part. Some of us will be really connected to the, I just want to be in the field planting hemp so that we could build a facility over there that will fill it up with hemp blocks that we will ship out to help build communities. How does holochain help me do that? Trying to figure out these higher level understandings of how fundamentally important holochain is to this. It is critical. Now, holochain is a few pieces. One is the technology itself, which is open source and which can be forked at any time and recreated. So if this group, for example, got together and we're going really well and we're built on holochain, all these collectives are on holochain, and the holochain organization goes under. They raised a bunch of money, they did their ICO, they built this amazing product, but they couldn't make the business model work. And since they're not operating in a vulnerable transparency world as Protocol.Love company, they essentially can make the choice without any input to go away because they're investors and all of that. They just make that decision. So now we are without an ambassador in the community of this technology, because that's all they are. They're just the ambassadors of this technology. That would then, of course, in the community of all these hundreds of thousands of people that are using holochain already, who in that community is going to bubble up and say, we're going to be the new holochain foundation and we're going to steward this on. What we are also going to see are people that come along and say, I want to build something different than holochain. Good for them. If it's better designed than holochain, then maybe we'll consider that's where Protocol.Love needs to go in the future. After 10 or 12 years of research, design, development, holochain is the most biomimicked technical solution on the planet that will be here forever if it continues moving the way it is. And there'll be a record of everything we do. And we'll have sovereignty in all the right places, and it's completely malleable, and none of us will have to worry about it because there's an amazing group of developers and scientists and social hackers and culturists doing this already that care about giving us the ability to do what we're doing. If that goes away, we are completely prepared to fork it and create that ambassadorship and steward that technical piece because it meets our requirements of vulnerable transparency, of sovereignty, of metacurrency, with the ability to create new metacurrencies and subcurrencies in an economic exchange where people can thrive without a single dollar being exchanged. And it was just pretty interesting that we could do all of that even without the holochain group, but with the technology, we can still do that. And some legal work, because they have done some legal work for us as well, to be the ability to create currencies on top of HoloFuel is autonomous. So we can go create currencies in 2 different formed places in the world. And all of a sudden have a new currency, put on an exchange and create value. So without that utility, I think we would need one, but the technology is sound and some of these newer systems. Some people have been looking at this for a long time and have created holochain, and some people have been looking at this for a few years and are creating alternatives.
I have one follow-up question on that. Your answer for me basically was summed up as it's not really very dependent because based off of the strength and size of the Protocol.Love community will creates alternative solutions, makes alternative solutions to holochain more likely. So in that sense, it seems to make a lot of sense that there would be a potential for holochain to have a competitor arise from within the community itself, which makes holochain integral at launch, but not necessarily integral to sustain over time, which I think
it's a completely anti-Roberts community. We all know in the holochain world, if we build on holochain, everybody's going to be in abundance. Forget wealthy. If everybody could just move their technical systems to the same internet without silos, everybody can sleep and get paid.
And it's just basically a distributed web protocol derived differently. And I've got basically based off of very different rules. So I like that part of it. My question then, I mean, most of my bigger questions have to do with my specific projects and how they might fit in or how they could be pushed forward by supporting what you guys are doing directly. And that's a much more specific question. I don't, I don't want to take up everybody's time on that now. The follow-up question that I had, I think I forgot it. So I'll get back later. It was very much relevant and tangential to what you were just saying, though.
Maybe I have a quick question. Maybe I can ask that in the meantime.
Please.
And thank you, Joel, for staying the extra time with us. Thank you, everyone, for also keeping the conversation going. My question was about particularly vulnerable transparency. And to me, my perspective when I read about vulnerable transparency, I saw it more on the individual, on the self scale. But now I'm understanding that it's more meant on the group scale per organization, within the organization of people. Is that true?
That is true. Absolutely.
I think there's a responsibility there for, if we are to do the Facilitators Guild, I think there's the responsibility of empowering vulnerable transparency of the selves as well as of the groups of people. Because that's the first step, is that people actually do know each other before they get to try to work together.
It seems like that would be collective dependent, though, right? Because like you might have collectives that might value in autonomy and basically privacy, to the extent where they want to have zero transparency about who the individuals within the collective are. So that way the collective itself can operate free without social consequences. So even though they're all members of the collective, there's not necessarily any transparency regarding what the individual decisions were within the collective. So I can see that being very dependent upon the interests of the collective themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think definitely this is
it's a really great point, Hadi, and I think it's one of the things that Aaron and I have spent some time talking about too, which is when we are the focalizer in a collective and we're pulling, we're making the phone calls, sending the emails, we're sharing a vision that's come through, and other people are like, oh, I had that too, but we're focalizing it. Our ability as that self, as that individual, operating in transparency. So when the questions start coming, when the circle forms and you're having conversations, there's three main parts to creating a collective foundational document or creating a collective. The first one is conversation. Like a group of people gets together, starts conversing around this new thing. At that stage, it is not as important or not as helpful, like you were saying, Tomo, in some cases for the guild or a facilitator to be facilitating the conversation, because the conversations, like you're saying, Hadi, are organic. They're getting to know each other. Maybe 2 people came together at first, and then there were 3, and now there's like 7 people, and 3 of the people don't know anybody else. And so as that conversation starting around that commonality of like, oh, we're starting a community, this is where we want to do it, this is about how much it'll cost, this is the things we'd like to have there. As that conversation becomes more robust and people start becoming that conversation, that's where they enter into formation, right? That's where the organism starts to be known. And that's where the foundational document comes together as the group. Now we layer this singular process called the foundational document on top of this collective of people having one or more conversations. That focuses the process into integrating all of those conversations into a purpose. And that's where then the transparency of the collective becomes most important, because now no longer is anybody an individual dream holder. The dreams have now come together into one umbrella, and everybody's agreed to give that dream a name and a form. They've also agreed to what the vision and the mission is. They've agreed to who is going to be the central counsel of this dream, which doesn't mean they will be living there or working there or giving money there. It just means that they have been a part of this conversation. They feel stewarded to this collective and want to stick it out and be here and help that process. And then underneath that is going to be accountabilities. So in this council of people that is now a collective, here are the individual accountabilities. So Hadi, Joel, Aaron, Raymond, Ed, Tomo, Jubilee, etc. now have accountabilities that are re-individualized. So individuals came together, had a conversation, now it's a group, now it's a collective, coming back down to the individual to identify accountabilities. In those accountabilities, we can start to see transparency of metrics. So Hadi, if you're responsible mainly for marketing, let's say, and part of the marketing metric is the number of people that come in and participate in your project or process or buy your product or join your community, whatever. That accountability and that metric are yours. However, it's the collective's. But you're the one helping bring it because you've identified yourself and everyone's agreed together and signed off on the fact that, yes, we definitely believe Hadi is the right person to take on the marketing accountability for this collective. So now the collective has this ability that is tied to an individual. So your transparency in the way that you operate increases your ability to operate. And anyone who's ever done any open source work, any open collaborative work, studied any kind of open psychology in organizations know that the minute you start talking, people listen if they don't know the information. If they know the information, they kind of tune it out. So the whole point here is to have everyone know the same information. And when that happens, the beautiful thing with transparency, vulnerable transparency, Hadi, is you empower your entire collective to be that much more powerful, because you yourself, personally, regardless of what collectives you're working in, you and yourself have made an agreement to just show up to this collective and every other one you're working with transparency, with vulnerability. This is how I'm feeling today. This is what's been coming through. This is the processing I'm doing. This is the dream I had. This is the healing I've been going through. This is a conversation I had with this person over here. Hey, here's this thing I put together 4 years ago. I don't know what it's for, but here, you can have it. Here's the list of everything I've ever built. Here, where do I put this, guys? Not your typical game A process of like, all right, so how do I get into the room and find job security? How do I find personal security? How do I feel safe and comfortable? You know, I could get in my house, in my box, in my office, in my job, and I can say I do things a certain way. But if anybody were to look, they could do the same exact thing. So the whole idea is like, let everybody look. And then that gives you the stage as an individual to take on that accountability of bringing that marketing and those metrics to that collective, and the collective and that council agreeing that you are the person, because they've seen you show up to conversations in vulnerability. So it is a personal choice. And also it's a personal choice of how to integrate that into the collective.
Thanks.
I just remembered, sorry, I have ADHD, so sometimes I blurt things out without thinking, sorry.
Thanks for the transparency.
No worries. And they just didn't want you to think I'm just rude for no reason. There's a good reason. Sorry. My question was from earlier, and that's the reason why I blurted out. I didn't want to forget again. Was at what point is essentially is it either in a currency exchange or a specific currency generated within everything that we're doing? Is it when information is accessed, or when agreed upon for conditions for an exchange to occur, or are tokens generated in each interaction or for specific interactions. Does that make sense? And maybe that might be more the more technical question for Ed. I don't know.
It's a great question, and I'll make it relatable. I keep using Aaron as an example just because I know a lot about his project. And so in this example of the sawmill and the community, right? Maybe it's a short story. It's getting written someday for kids. The sawmill and the community. Right. I don't know. So the community is operating vulnerable transparency. They've agreed to use Protocol.Love. All of the central council has been created. They've set up their first venture funds. Those venture funds, one of them has been identified to support the logistics and resources required to build out the infrastructure for the community. So in that venture fund, there's a smaller circle that manages those funds from that venture fund that the central council identified as necessary to be a community. So Aaron, excuse me, being who he is also on that smaller little circle connected to that specific venture fund. That specific venture fund has a limit that's been apportioned to it by the central council, a budget. Here's the budget. Now, if you go over it, okay, because we know there's a protocol. If you're going to go over $500,000, then here's the protocol. Like, here's the document. We all agreed on this in the central council. We go through with the ledger, we fill it out, we have a Zoom, we click a couple buttons, and then, oh, okay, now we're spending $700,000. Okay, everybody's fine. In that little circle, Aaron goes over to the lumberyard. He knows how much capital budget he has to work with. Now he knows that's all in a digital currency that community has created, that is a part of this larger ecosystem. And let's say the Protocol.Love coin, those are the Love coin. Love coin is holding a specific value for us as humanity. That's built on top of hollow fuel. And the reason it's built on top of hollow fuel is because the only way to show this transparency to ourselves is to have it in some sort of digital realm, technology, so that all of us can be together in time and space to see the same information. So hollow fuel has a base value because it's based on computing. Everybody that's using the system is basically generating value to that base currency without doing anything. All right, so that's taken care of. Step two is we have this love coin, right? Love is the medicine. We're all trying to get to the love coin, right? And so on top of the networking, that's where we lay the love. Because if love was the absolute foundation, we would need technology. We don't need technology. We don't need it. We are the technology. And we just need to be together, right? But since we're all across the world and there's so many of us, we do need a technology. And so we put our love on top of that. We infuse that technology with love. And then Aaron comes along with his community and puts a coin on top of that, the community coin there, an interconnected community coin. Now he creates that currency in that community, goes and does all the process, goes through the foundational document, goes through the legal process, creates a currency, puts it on exchange. In that venture fund, part of that currency goes into that venture fund to say you have access to 500,000, quote unquote, relative US dollars, fiat relative. That's because the land that community was built on is worth $4.5 million, let's say. That asset was put on that community coin to back that currency, which is on top of the love, which is on top of the networking. So networking, all of the ecosystems across the world equals the love coin. Now their interconnected community coin has $4.5 million asset to it, which is essentially a promise or a buy order, right, to supply energy into that coin of 4.5 million, quote unquote, dollars. And they also use that to then bring in fiat dollars. So now they have an asset worth $4.5 million that can be exchanged in different ways, fractionalized, et cetera, because they have ownership rights. And a promisor, or typically what we would call an investor, came along and said, I love your property. I love what your vision is. I love that you can articulate it. I love how excited everybody is. I want to give you $1 million. So that $1 million goes as a buy order on that currency, the interconnected community currency, which is on top of the love currency, which is on top of the networking or the fuel for all of this to work. So now $5.5 million in this currency coin, right, is equitable to be exchanged and used. Part of that $500,000 goes into that venture fund Okay, now we're at Aaron in the story. So Aaron in the story is operating under that community coin, goes and says, hey, lumberyard, you're right here. I found another lumberyard across the country that does what we need. Here's what they do. I was wondering if you could do this. And they're like, oh my gosh, we would love to, because, you know, because of COVID, you know, because COVID, we're not doing any lumber because COVID, right? And Aaron's like,
Right.
I got you. Like, we're so happy because COVID, we have a lot of work to do. Like, here you go. And so everybody's happy, and an exchange comes into play, and they're like, all right, well, that'll be $500,000. So Aaron has two choices. Right? First choice is, well, if I can get them in the currency, then I actually don't have to give them any money. That's important, because if that conversation could be facilitated for that lumberyard to come in on the interconnected community coin and hold that value, now they own a certain portion of that digital currency in their digital wallet. It might be new for them. First time anybody there has ever done that, but Aaron was able to facilitate that. So now there's $500,000 in this digital currency called interconnected community coin that this lumberyard has. They own $500,000. That whole venture fund has been leaked out there now. So no longer does the venture fund and interconnected community hold it. Someone else is holding it. But the work is getting done. The work is now done. The value has been exchanged. Everybody's happy. It wasn't over budget unless everybody agreed to it. That currency is still in the ecosystem, still on top of love, still available as love to be exchanged to another lumberyard somewhere else, or to another business, or to somewhere else. And it's still growing essentially because of networking ability, because they now have a digital currency that's listening and watching transactions on holochain. They are now supplying the energy by using their devices, essentially, using the apps that Aaron set them up with to use this currency. They're generating the necessity for HoloFuel to be in existence, therefore supplying its value. And not one single dollar has left Aaron's community. That is a very important fact, because now Aaron can go back over there and say, you know, I have a lot of other communities that are really asking for this really great service. So what I'd love to do is see if you can do business with them in this way. And now Aaron's like facilitating this whole new ecosystem to pop up out of nowhere. And some of that $500,000 in currency makes its way back in the interconnected community, as well as 10 other communities, because they don't, what are they going to do with the currency? They don't need the currency, they need the exchange. The exchange is doing the work. Doing the work is where they get the purpose, right? Holding the currency is just a way to say, oh, we got paid, yay, right? So they pay their workers. Their workers, half of them decide to take just regular paychecks because they're not set up for all of this. The other half are like, this is great, I'm going to put half my paycheck into this digital currency now, and I can easily take it out of my wallet if I want to. Thanks, Aaron, for teaching me all this stuff. It wasn't hard. The only dollars that leave the love currency or the holo currency or the interconnected community currency are those fiat exchanges from that entity, the mill, of the workers who decided to take their paychecks in US dollar. Everything else is still available in that currency. And that's an economic factor, like when we look at US dollar versus euro, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
this is us printing our own money. So when Aaron says, I need another $500,000 to go do that again, he just creates $500,000 in connected coin. He already has a $4.5 million asset, already has a $1 million promiser. He's got $5.5 million to work with, and he wants to create another $2.5 million. So he just creates it, puts it in a new venture fund, puts some of it over to this new venture fund that's set up with this business partner, this sawmill, who's now like doing an innovative work and documenting it. And now Aaron is investing in them to further invest in our community or the ecosystems of people that need this type of mill work. And so it's literally giving us the ability to create our own Federal Reserve process. Once we have enough asset, once we have enough energy back, we basically just continue to create.
And it's a diversified, they're diversified securities. So it allows you to, okay, that makes a lot, and that actually also, I mean, you indirectly answered my question. I basically, for a while, I haven't used these terms before, but I've been thinking about a truth coin and a joy coin. And I just have never articulated it in that particular way. I've always thought of it more of as a specific process, credibility process for cross-disciplinary research, and providing a UBI for usage while securing IP without having to worry about derivatives of your IP entering into the marketplace and diluting its value. So that was really my big thing, was like, how does that necessarily work? Is it required that a given token that is being entered into the enmeshed with the love token and the token, if it has to follow a very specific linear pattern, or if it can be actually similar in that interactions are generating tokens, which are creating value, which is part of how that would work. And it seems like that absolutely would be the case, that you can actually do it so that way it's it seems like I could plug in that kind of infrastructure within this, so that way it could be an independent yet mutually supportive sort of process in there. I definitely want to talk more about that specifically, to see actually how viable it is, because where I get lost is in the not in the systemic process, but the more technical aspects of it. So and that's where I'm very, very curious about how well that can actually mesh, because if it can, I think that there's actually this is absolutely tremendous.
This is absolutely tremendous. This is 12 years or more of extremely, extremely talented, smart people creating. Like, a lot of us have had this in our DNA. We all have this in our DNA. Some of us have it in our visions. Some of us have it in our bodies. Some of us have it in our minds. Some of the people have had it all encompassed and created the foundations for us to go and do this. And the Facilitators Guild is a way to weave this throughout the world in our each unique ways. Some of us are going to be doing it and are doing it with holochain, like going to the very core where all this happening and saying, let's do this together. Let's come up with these protocols. Let's support the equal exchange of information. Let's write white papers for the community so that people can be self-empowered to create their own currencies, their own paradigms. Because it's a free market, essentially, to each individual and collective. The Protocol Guild, Protocol Facilitators Guild, is important because it gives us all this community to start wielding and crafting and weaving this into the organization's collectives ideas that not only we are working on, but people we know are working on. And once we become that energy center, the more we learn about the currency, the more we learn about how to interconnect, the more we learn how to just share and do the document together and not worry about the techniques, or at some point worry about the techniques, like it's not going to be that hard. Like our goal at CoGov and Protocol.Love is to build a lot of the tools and systems that are open source, that anybody could use, that is participatory in nature, meaning you can use it as it is today, or you can fork it, copy, paste it, do it your own thing with it, and not get support because it's yours. Like, period. Like you can fork it, and the support is, here's how we're doing it. You could do it however you want. This is what we know is working. And if you feel this should change, why don't you stop doing your own thing and come over here and help us do this thing? Because then we can help the meta currencies ground even deeper into some of these new fundamental flows and currencies that are popping up out of nowhere that Aaron and Tomo and Joel and Ray and all these people are discovering by facilitating what are actual currencies on this planet. And this is like a huge shift. Is like if Aaron and I and you are going to start a community together, and I'm going to bring $1 million, or I'm talking about it, and Aaron's going to bring all the ideas and energy, and you're going to bring all the kind of economic and finance and marketing science to it, we're going to agree how to do this. And you guys are probably going to agree on your own how to do it, because I just have the money. And then you're going to approach me with a certain way of saying things and and crafting paperwork or redeveloping or defining a conversation around a relationship that was there to a new one. Because now it's like, my value is more in the money. I don't really want to live there. I don't really want to participate too much, but I feel like if you had this $1 million, you could use it. It would help, right? This changes the dynamic of how this relationship evolves over time by just putting in some simple metrics of transparency. By saying in an open conversation that you're just the money guy, I'm just the money guy. So we're all saying the same thing. Joel's just the money guy. Joel's just the money guy. All right, and that's on paper, right? Joel's not going to come in next year and say, all right, so you want some money, I see, and you want to take some of this currency out and buy this thing. You're going to pay $500,000 to this mill. Why are you going to do that, Aaron? And Aaron's like, oh, because this is how we have to do it. He's all excited. And then Tomo's like, yeah, we have to do it this way because this is what the science says. This is what all the numbers are. And either way, doesn't make a hill of bean of difference because it's my money. And the agreement we made in the beginning were on terms that were advantageous to me getting my money back. That's how Game A works. And all the contracts that we can find, all the lawyers, all the banks, all of those things are going to be written for me, not for you, for me. And if you have the legal resource, experience, and knowledge as you guys to go back and recraft all of that to match the language necessary to give you the energetic kind of ability to operate autonomously, then that would be fine. Because then I'll send it to my lawyers and my lawyers would be like, yeah, whatever, these guys are great. Or my lawyers would be like, no, they're trying to change the way the rules go and it kind of is a little more in their favor now. See how the dynamics work, even if we're friends? When we get down to the contracts, when we get down to the paperwork, when we get down to buying a piece of property or buying a building or renting something and there's paperwork involved, not having transparency to fall back on, now we're asking permission. For who? Why do we need to ask permission? You guys, you do whatever you want. All we're trying to facilitate is seeing currency in a new way, labeling it, identifying it, put it on the holochain by using a basic websites that are now just technically different going on the holochain, data-wise. In just doing these simple protocols, what we have given ourselves access to is, like Aaron was talking about, like a Bitcoin. Like now all of a sudden, I had $1,000, but now I have $3,300. Why? Because someone out there is generating so much love. So much love has just popped up out of nowhere that my $1,000 in coin is now $3,300.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, so and that's the way I look at what I'm understanding what you're articulating. Organic versus for the value system.